Let me introduce you to a witch named Dipsas. We're overdue for some spooky content on this channel, and it's never too early to generate hype for Halloween, so here we are. Dipsas appears in just one poem, Ovid's Amores 1.8, and she uses her powers for evil. In this case, trying to convince the narrator's girl to leave him. The poem is part of a collection of romantic poetry that Ovid produced in the 1st century BCE during the Augustan period. His contemporaries wrote similar collections, especially Propertius and Tibullus, and we'll compare with them later in this video. Witches were popular figures in Greek and Roman poetry from the very beginning. Homer wrote about Circe, you have early stories of Medea, Theocritus writes about Samantha, a woman who uses Assyrian magic to try and get her lover back. And Ovid and his contemporaries help solidify the image of the witch and what she could do. And to be so clear, we're not talking about actual women, because it's usually women. We're not talking about actual women performing actual magic in the ancient world. Real-life magical practice and literary witchcraft are related but basically separate categories. So today we are talking about a literary witch who is entirely constructed in the mind of the poet. These literary witches served a narrative and thematic function, namely to explain the unexplainable and to invite fear into the reader. The scholar Maxwell Paul puts it, each witch is, in essence, a blank canvas onto which a myriad of fears and anxieties may be mapped. Today we'll read Ovid's description of Dipsas and what she can do, and look at what it can tell us about the kinds of things that literary witches were supposed to be able to do, and where Ovid fits into the literary witchcraft tradition, what may have influenced him, and whose work he influenced later on. If you're new here, welcome. This is Hearth of Haemonia. We talk about all things magic, witchcraft, religion, spirituality in the ancient world. If this is your kind of thing, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And with that, let's meet our witch. The poem describes a conversation that Ovid claims to have overheard between his girl, and it's unclear what kind of a relationship they have, and this woman Dipsas. And we learn that Dipsas is a madam of a brothel or a manager of sex workers, and the girl in question appears to be one of her employees. And Dipsas wants to give this girl some advice about how to make the most money, and that includes, unfortunately for Ovid, not associating with starving artists. So most of the poem is Dipsas' speech and advice to this girl. But it begins with a description of Dipsas herself, what she looks like and what her magical powers are. Then we get the speech, as I said, for most of the rest of the poem, and at the very end, Ovid reacts to what he has heard, and he curses Dipsas. I'm not going to spend too much time on this curse because it's not like a technical, magical curse. There's not really all that much for us to dig into. He just wishes for her to have long winters and to die in poverty and have endless thirst. So I'm not going to get into that too much, but it is worth noting that cursing a madam in this way because she's trying to convince this girl to break up with you is a trope in this genre of Roman poetry. You see it come up in Propertius and Tibullus as well. And it doesn't matter whether the woman is a witch or not. I mostly want to focus on the beginning of the poem where we get the description of Dipsas as a witch. And to do so, we're going to read the first 30 or so lines. Now, I have this version of Ovid's Amores Ars Amatoria Remedia, translated by Peter Green. This is a Penguin. I think for your everyday use, this is totally fine. I think Peter Green is a competent translator. I haven't read the whole thing, but what I've read so far of some of these poems, it's quite good. However, because we are talking about technical, magical, and as you'll see, some astrological stuff, this translation actually I'm not going to use for this video because at one point Peter Green translates an astrological term, but totally changes it from the Latin. He writes that Venus is on the ascendant, but in the Latin it says Venus is in signo suo, her own sign, which is not the same thing as the ascendant. This is a really minor point, and so if you are just trying to read these poems as a whole, or if your interests are not in technical, magical, and astrological language, then I think getting a published translation like that is absolutely fine. But because we are trying to be so specific here, I went ahead and translated the first 30 lines myself, and that's what I'm going to use for this video. Not that I am a better translator than Peter Green, I am absolutely not. I produced a workman's translation, but I wanted to make sure that we were getting all of the technical language, so that's why I'm doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and read my translation, and as always, I am so open to feedback on the Latin if you have thoughts about that. There's a certain woman, whoever wants to learn about Elena, he should hear this. There's a certain old woman named Dipsas. She gets her name from the thing. She didn't see the parent of Black Memnon on rosy horses sober. She knew magic arts and Aeaean spells, and she turned flowing waters back on their head. She knew well which herb, which thread activated by a turned rhombus, which slime of a mare in heat had power. When she wanted, clouds were collected across the whole heaven. When she wanted, daylight flashed in a clear sky. I saw, if you can believe such a thing, the stars dripping with blood. The face of the moon was purple with it. I suspect that this woman, transformed, flies around through nighttime shadows and covers her old woman's body with plumage. I suspect it, and that's the rumor. Also, a double pupil shines in her eyes, and light comes from the twin orb. She calls out from ancient tombs, great-great-grandfathers and great-great-great-great-grandfathers, and splits the solid ground with a long spell. She set herself to desecrating chaste marriage beds, nor was she lacking a tongue that harmed, even if it was eloquent. Chance gave me as a witness to her conversation. She was advising such things, the double doors hid me. Do you know, my light, that yesterday you were pleasing to that blessed young man? He clung to you and kept staring at your face. And why shouldn't you be pleasing? Your form is second to none. Wretched me, conduct worthy of your body is missing. I wish that you were as fortunate as you are most beautiful. I won't be a pauper once you've been made rich. The opposite star of Mars was hurting you as you opposed it. Mars has gone away. Now Venus is fitting in her own sign. She then goes on for the rest of the poem to give non-magical advice, which basically boils down to use your feminine wiles to seduce men to give you the most money and gifts that will all eventually trickle down to me, and I will be made wealthy through your work. As I said, we're going to focus on the magical part of the poem today. But before we can get into the list of Dipsas's powers, we have to talk about Propertius 4.5. Propertius is a contemporary of Ovid, and he writes the same kind of poetry, similar style, and as you will see, Propertius 4.5 is kind of a sister poem to Ovid's poem. The structure's a little bit different. As you can see, he begins with cursing the witch, followed by her witchy powers, then the speech, and then it ends, but the setup is the same. A madam tries to convince one of her charges to leave her poor starving artist, poet, man to get more money from wealthier men. And when you get into the Latin, there's a lot of overlap as well. There's textual references between the poems. You can see how closely related these poems are. Now, which poem came first is a subject of scholarly argument. There's different opinions. O'Neill thinks that Propertius came first and presents a pretty compelling argument. I've listed that article in the description along with some others. O'Neill shows point by point that when Ovid makes a reference to another poem, he does it in a particular way, and you can find some of that here. This is like nitty-gritty philology stuff, but it shows, I think, convincingly that Propertius came first, and that is the model for Dipsas and Ovid's poem. McKeown, who's one of the commentators on this poem, writes a commentary on the Amores, thinks that it's equally likely that Ovid could have been the model for Propertius. In general, you can learn a lot by figuring out which poem influenced another poem. In terms of developing the literary witch, though, I don't think it matters as much for us which one came first. What matters for us is that during this period, poets were creating and cataloging the witch and her powers. And as McKeown says, quote, "Nearly all the powers attributed to Dipsas are practically canonical." These two poems, and as we'll see, some work of Tibullus as well, create a canon of writing witches in Latin poetry. And their individual powers may vary, and that's where artistic freedom comes in. Each poet can decide how they want to represent their witch and what their witch can do, but listing their powers, and there are some powers that are pretty standard across these lists, that is being created in this period by Propertius, by Tibullus, by Ovid. Turning now to the description of Dipsas and her witchy powers. And beginning with her name. So she is named Dipsas, which is not a usual Latin name. It's the name of a kind of snake that people in antiquity thought could cause and itself suffered from unquenchable thirst. And Ovid says that she gets her name from the thing that she was never sober. This line about the parent of Memnon and the rosy horses. This is a very roundabout way of saying dawn or morning. So she never met a morning sober. It's a common trope that elderly women had drinking problems, and she's described as an old woman, an anus. And so she is a drunk, and she's named after a snake that has perpetual thirst, and in fact, at the end, when Ovid curses her, he curses her with unquenchable thirst. And she is, as I said, a madam, or a Lena. And again, this is a type of character in elegiac poetry. Sometimes they are witches, sometimes they are not, but they are the kind of classic enemy of the lover poet because they're trying to convince the girl to break up with the poet and be with someone who is richer. So she's a kind of rival of Ovid, and she has lots of magic powers. So she knew magic arts and Aeaean spells. Magic is always thought of as an art, ars in Latin, techne in Greek, and the word magus or magos goes all the way back to, yes, the magi, these Persian priests, diviners, whatever, that come into Greek and Roman literature as magicians, and it's where we get the word, and they come into the Bible as the wise men who came to visit the baby Jesus. She knows Aeaean spells, so Aeaea, the worst word in Latin or Greek, it's an island where Circe lives, and in some sources is the birthplace of Medea. So we get this reference at the very beginning to the most famous literary witches, the oldest literary witches, Circe and Medea. And Dipsas knows Aeaean spells. The word here is carmina, or Carmen in the singular, and I'm translating it as spells, but it has a wide range of meanings. It can mean song, it can mean poem, it can mean chant or enchantment, it can mean spell, as it does in this case. This is a really useful word for Augustan poets because during this period, we see it with Virgil, we see it with Ovid, they were styling themselves as wates, which is a word, another wide-ranging word that means anything from poet bard to prophet seer. So poets were styling themselves as having a kind of prophetic ability, and they deliver prophecy through their carmina. So again, the word carmen here, it means spell, as in any form of verbal magic. Dipsas can also make rivers run back in their course. It's unclear specifically what making a river run back in its course might do magically, but what it demonstrates is the ability to control the natural world. And this is one of the major categories of witch powers, is that they are able to control the natural world through their magic and at will. This poem repeats, if she wanted, and other poems do this as well, Propertius, Tibullus. The witch can control things however she wants. So that's, I think, what we can take from the river running back in its course. She knows about herbs. Herbal magic is pretty standard, one of the most common and well-known forms of magic. And then you get the thread and the rhombus. So the rhombus here seems to be basically the same thing or something very similar to a well-known magical object, the yunx, which is a magic wheel of some kind, and as you turn it, I'm not sure exactly how the mechanism works, but it's used in love magic or erotic magic. So in Theocritus's Idyll number 2, Samantha uses this along with potions and incantations and other stuff to get her lover back. And in fact, Aphrodite uses a yunx in Pindar's Pythian number 4, which is about Medea. Well, about Jason and Medea. So the yunx is some kind of spinning wheel that is used in love magic, and the rhombus seems like it might be the same thing. These things are kind of obscure. There's not a tremendous amount of examples, and we don't know exactly how it was supposed to work, but it was some kind of spinning wheel. She also knows that you can use the slime of a mare in heat in magic. The word for this is hippomanes, and it refers to two different equine substances, either the slime secreted by a mare in heat, or it is some kind of slimy thing on the forehead of a newborn foal that the mother eats after the newborn foal is born, and that helps with I'm not sure, I know there's a word for this, the biological impulse of the mother to love the foal. It is used in love magic in antiquity. It was thought that if you take this away from the mother, then you can use it, and whoever consumes it will be effectively cursed with infatuation, insatiable infatuation with somebody. So as you can imagine, it was used in love magic and as an aphrodisiac. And there is actually quite a bit of testimony about this in ancient writing. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In Pliny's Natural History, he says this, quote, "In the equine genus, the pregnant female is delivered standing up, and she loves her offspring more than all other female animals. And in fact, a love poison called horse frenzy, hippomanes, is found in the forehead of horses at birth, the size of a dried fig, black in color, which a brood mare, as soon as she has dropped her foal, eats up, or else she refuses to suckle the foal. If anybody takes it before she gets it and keeps it, The scent drives him into madness of the kind specified. And my favorite instance where this shows up in poetry is in the Aeneid, because believe it or not, when Dido is preparing her funeral pyre, which is equal parts a suicide and a curse, we can get into all of that another time. When she does this and tricks her sister into helping her, they use the hippomanes as part of the spell. So Dido sends Anna to fetch a bunch of things, and Virgil says, quote, "Sought also was the love snatched from a mother, plucked away from the forehead of a newborn foal." So Dipsas knows which items to use when constructing her magic spells. Then we get more manipulation of the natural world. She can put clouds all across the sky, and she can take clouds out of the sky to create a clear day. And it's worth noting that these things, the rivers, the clouds, these are the domains of gods. And the fact that Dipsas or any witch is able to change them means that they at least can compete with the power of the gods. And that is a whole rabbit hole of scholarship. The relationship between the witches and the gods and their rivalry and how they interact with each other. It's a whole vein of scholarship that is endlessly fascinating, but that's like a video in and of itself. But these witches can hold their own in the natural world, and they can manipulate it at will, again, whenever they want to. And not just the natural world, but the heavens themselves. So the stars and the moon are both either blood red or dripping with blood in this poem. Now, the part about the stars dripping with blood seems to be unique to Ovid. This seems not to show up anywhere else in these kinds of lists. But the moon being red with blood or purple with blood is a reference to eclipses. And if you've ever seen an eclipse, you can understand why. Witches were thought, in some cases, to actually cause eclipses. This is the famous witchy power to draw down the moon from the sky. You see this over and over and over again. It's one of the most famous things that the witches can do. They can take the moon out of the sky, and presumably once they have it, they use it for magic. And so eclipses were thought to be this phenomenon. When there is an eclipse, that means a witch is drawing the moon down from the sky to use in her spell work. Then Ovid says that he wouldn't be surprised to find out if this woman was covering herself in feathers and flying around after being transformed, presumably into an owl. Witches were associated with owls. The Strix is a kind of owl. It's a screech owl. And it was considered to be a bird of ill omen. If you saw one, it was a bad sign. And so they get associated with witches as well. Witches transforming themselves, that's a pretty common trope, and especially transforming into owls. We see this in later literature with Apuleius's Golden Ass or the Metamorphosis, where a witch puts like some kind of potion on her body, and then she grows feathers and she takes off into the night. So Dipsas presumably can do this as well, or at least it wouldn't surprise Ovid. Dipsas has double pupils in her eyes. This is a reference to the evil eye. People were thought to have like double pupils as a sign that they're like casting the evil eye on someone. So she can do that as well. And casting the evil eye, it's a protection symbol, but it's also a symbol of aggression. And the symbol of the evil eye, like on doorways and stuff, is thought to ward off the evil eye. So it's kind of like you use the thing to ward off the thing. Give the evil eye an equal match. But those with double pupils apparently, and in Dipsas's case, glowing eyes, that's her casting the evil eye on people. And then finally, she calls out ancestors from their tombs. Ovid uses those great words, great-great-grandfather and great-great-great-great-grandfather, but really what he means is just ancestral spirits. Other poets, when they write this part of the catalog, will just say manes. So she can call out spirits of the dead up from their tombs, standard necromancy. And of course, we don't have any idea how she does this. Ovid doesn't write the kind of ritual that she does, but she practices necromancy. And with her long spell, her long carmen, she splits the solid ground. So she's opening up a gate to hell. This is decidedly dark magic. So we've gone from making rivers run back in their course all the way down to opening up a chasm and unleashing hell on earth. So Dipsas is apparently a very, very, very powerful witch. Like I said, these lists of witchcraft powers are standard. They show up everywhere. You can see on the screen here, I'll put the ones from Propertius 4.5 and Tibullus 1.2. Each of these poems presents a list of magic powers. And even though Propertius 4.5 is the closest poem to Ovid, you can see that the powers that, in this case, the witch is named Acanthis, the powers that Acanthis has are different. She forces people to fall in love. She can make a magnet attract iron. She has influence over animals. She can dissolve things in water by use of certain herbs. She makes rules for the moon. This one's pretty similar. This is probably drawing down the moon. And she does transform herself into an animal, but it's a wolf. She can blind husbands who maybe would be spying on their women or checking in on them to make sure that they're not cheating. She takes counsel with the owls, and she uses the hippomanes. Interestingly enough, Tibullus 1.2, which is a different kind of poem, it's a type of poem, and Ovid has one of these as well, where the poet is stuck outside the closed door of the house of his lover, and he's outside just kind of yelling at the house like, let me in, let me in. And so in Tibullus's version of that kind of poem, it's called a komos, that's where the witch shows up. And Tibullus is in cahoots with the witch. She gave him some kind of magic to use for him and his girl to get together without her man knowing. But as you can see, looking at this list, she can draw stars down from the sky. She can turn rivers back in their course. She splits the ground and calls ghosts from their tombs and summons bones from the pyre. She removes clouds from the sky. There's a lot of things in here that are similar to Dipsas's powers. So you can see how these two poems are in conversation with one another. And again, all of these poets are contemporaries with one another. They would have been in the same literary circle and they would have been experimenting with the same themes and ideas. And their experiments create kind of the canon of how to write literary witches. And later authors draw from these works and are inspired by them when they're writing their own witches. I'll just give you my favorite example, which is Lucan. Erichtho is the baddest of the bad witches, because Lucan's poem, he's writing during the time of Nero, so he's writing in a time where things are not looking great, and literary tastes are tending towards the dark and spooky even more, and especially tastes are becoming more violent. This is the era when you get Seneca's Thyestes, which has cannibalism in it, and Lucan is writing such gory and violent poetry. He's writing about the war between Caesar and Pompey. The descriptions of the violence are so gory as to almost be comical, and some scholars take it as like satirical. And going along with the dark and spooky theme, some of his characters visit a witch. As I said, her name is Erichtho, and she is in Thessaly, home of the witches. And so we get a long description, a very long, pages and pages long description of, first, what witches in Thessaly can do, and second, what Erichtho herself can do. So I went through this long description. This is the translation I use, the Susan Braund translation. Love it. Fabulous. So I went through and I picked out some of the pieces of this description that mirror what Ovid says. So here they are. Thessalian witches and Erichtho know about herbs that can harm you. The spells and the chants that they use have all sorts of effects, including inducing love in those who aren't naturally in love. In other words, forcing erotic fixation on somebody. They know about poisons. They have the hippomanes. Braund translates this as, quote, when they steal the promise, swelling with the forehead's juice of mother's love. They can control nature, including making thunder without Jupiter knowing, making the sea swell without winds, bringing down mountains, doing all kinds of stuff like that. And Erichtho specifically does necromancy, including taking bones and body parts from tombs and funeral pyres. And then the opposite of that, not only does she raise the dead, but she uses her magic to kill people. So you can see how certain things carry over from the Augustan poets, the elegiac poets, Ovid, Propertius, Tibullus, especially something so specific as the hippomanes, and controlling nature, being able to manipulate mountains and rivers and clouds and weather and the moon. All of these things just get recycled with new literary witches. And then the last thing I want to cover is the little bit of astrology that we get in this poem. At the beginning of Dipsas' speech, as I read, she tells this girl that Mars, the planet Mars, was acting up and was hindering her, but now that that's cleared away and Venus is well placed, she should be more successful in her amorous endeavors. Astrology would have been well known at the time, especially to the intellectual classes of which Ovid was a part, so he would have known about astrology. He writes about astrology. It shows up especially in the Fasti. Can we go one video without me mentioning the Fasti? And so you see it here as well. The opposite star of Mars was hurting you as you opposed it. Mars has gone away. Now Venus is fitting in her own sign. In the astrology of this period, which is basically Hellenistic astrology that was adopted by the Romans, Mars is considered a malefic and Venus is considered a benefic. So whatever Mars is doing, it's going to be bad, and whatever Venus is doing, it's going to be good. And as a witch, Dipsas would have been dabbling in astrology herself. So as she says to the girl, Mars was acting up and that's why nothing good was happening, but now Venus is in her own sign. That would be the sign either of Taurus or Libra. Venus is considered the ruler of those two signs. Venus being well positioned in her own sign means that the area of life that Venus controls, you can guess what that is, it's love, that area is now going to have more success in it. I wasn't sure exactly what to do with contraria and oppositi because they both kind of mean opposing, but opposing is a technical term in astrology. It's an aspect, and an aspect is when two planets or celestial bodies are in a particular configuration with each other, and some of the aspects are positive and some are negative. So an opposition, a square, these things are negative, whereas like a trine or a sextile is positive. So not only is Mars a malefic planet, but it also was in a bad position. But now, as she says, Mars abit, Mars has gone away, and now Venus is in signo sua, so you're going to be more successful. And of course, Venus and Mars, love and war, are natural opposites, and they are a favorite of Ovid and other love poets. So a number of Ovid's Amores are about this dichotomy between love and war. He begins his collection by detailing an actual physical fight that he had with Cupid, a literal battle with Cupid, and the poem that follows this one is about how every lover is at war. So love and war is a favorite kind of dichotomy in this kind of poetry. So when Ovid is choosing the astrology to include in this poem, these are the planets that he chooses. If you want to get into this poem or this topic even more, I have some bibliography to recommend to you. The primary texts that I used for this video are these bad boys. This is the text and commentary by J.C. McKeown on Ovid's Amores in 4 volumes. So I have here the first 2. These are exceptional pieces of scholarship. The first volume is just the text with a very, 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 very nice introduction. And the second volume is the commentary on book 1. It's not so much a philological commentary, so if you're looking for help with the Latin, it doesn't really do that. But what it does is it provides a lot of historical background and especially a lot of literary comparisons. So I highly recommend these. They are kind of pricey, but absolutely worth it. And they are published by Francis Cairns. I was very, 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 very fortunate to actually take a class with Francis Cairns on this topic, and that's where I got these books for that class. Francis Cairns is amazing. J.C. McKeown's texts are amazing, and so if you're really into this topic, I would recommend getting them. I can also recommend a couple of articles that you can find for free on JSTOR. I went on a whole rant in the last video about JSTOR, so I'll spare you. So the first, as I mentioned, is Maxwell Paul's treatment of the vocabulary of Roman witchcraft. And what I like about this article, even though the words that are addressed are not necessarily used in this poem, it shows that the specific individual words don't necessarily denote hyper-technical distinctions between powers or between kinds of witches. Roman poetry takes advantage of the semantic range of each word. So we talked about Carmen, which can mean anything from poem to song to spell to chant to enchantment. It has a wide range. And so what this article does is it shows that certain words are used, even though it's the same word, it's used different ways in different places. So you can't really use these words as evidence that, oh, this is one kind of witch and that's another kind of witch. It's a technical, philological argument, but I think it's really valuable. I also recommend, I mentioned Carol O'Neill, who shows that Propertius was more likely the inspiration for Ovid as opposed to the other way around. So I like that article as well. And then finally, if you want to learn more about the character of the Lena, the madam, in this kind of poetry, Sarah Myers has an article that just takes this character type and analyzes it in a bunch of different poems. So that's what I would recommend if you want to take this topic further. And that's all I have for you today. This was a little bit of a shorter video, or at least I'm assuming it will be shorter, but I hope it was useful to you. My main takeaway here is that this poem fits into a larger tradition, and even though Dipsas only shows up in the one poem, this kind of thing is not unique. And Ovid's contemporaries each present their own version of this. And that all of them together are creating a type of character that then gets adapted and changed in later literature to suit different genres and different literary styles and thematic aims. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, you can leave me a thumbs up down below. And as always, I like to hear what you have to say in the comments. The comments on the last video were absolutely amazing. Thank you all so much for taking the time to write your thoughts down and to put me onto new references and stuff. Yeah, if you have any thoughts about this video or this topic, please let me know in the comments down below. And while we're here, take a good look at this background, because this is the last time you're going to see me in this specific spot, because in the next video, we are going to be redoing this whole room and reconfiguring this space to make it more intentional. And as I mentioned before, this is a matter of spiritual significance to me, so I'm going to take you along on that journey. And then finally, I have finished my run of Ovid's Fasti over on Instagram, and I have started a new project where I'm taking the paintings of John William Waterhouse and pairing them with ancient art and ancient literature. So if that is something that interests you, you can find me over on Instagram. And otherwise, I will see you back here, not in this specific spot, but rethinking this space next time. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you then.